Right, there we go. Okay,
Good.
Oh, that's good.
right. Now, I guess no one's coming on. Never mind. No, Mark watches the recordings. If anyone gets cold, please say it. It smells very damp from the radiator, so I've opened the window.
Which one, Lee?
Huh?
Which one, Lee?
That one came off the wall.
Oh.
They're doing that quite a lot. The one at the back of the hall that did that. Strange. Okay, I think we got up to, oh, it's very topical, isn't it? War and
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
I think we got up to about here. Is that all right, Achan?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So if you recall, the very strict rules about the spoils of war, and what you could take and what you couldn't. And this chap Achan evidently had been greedy, and he had taken some. We're going to find out what it was.
Are you recording?
Oh, thank you. No, good point. I'm also not screen sharing. Thanks for that. Oops, 1 second. Let's try again. Right. Record. Well spotted. Oh no, we are recording. Oh, wait, are we? Oh, we are recording. Doesn't say. Maybe that means recording. Says it's strange. Yeah, it says it's recording. Okay, seems to be.
Yeah. It's
Strange.
pause or stop. So.
Okay. So we'll see what he took in a minute. I think we're up to, I think we finished the previous slide. That's all right. We said that this was done by lottery with the Urim V'Tumim, with the breastplate, right? That used to give them answers to things. So I don't know exactly how they did it, but they would light up the relevant tribe and the relevant family. I guess it was a fair system because it was divinely mandated. I think we're up to here. Harold, you like to read number 19? Can you see okay from there?
Yes. And Joshua said to Achan, my son, give, I pray you, glory to the Lord God of Israel, and make confession to him, and tell me now what you have done. Do not hide anything from me.
We just recap for a minute. Were they given a chance to own up previously and no one came forward?
I can't remember. I don't remember that.
Well, he said in the morning we'll come and we'll out the person it was. I wonder if that was the cue to come and own up. But he doesn't, of course, own up until he's stood at court. I wonder if there would have been a chance to have made good if he would have done so. If your leader says to you tomorrow morning, I'm going to consult the Urim V'Tumim and we will find out who it is that has brought this curse upon us, that might be your cue to say, well, let me save you the bother, actually, it's me. I don't know if there's an element of his thinking he can hide. But people do that. People are funny about things like that. It always amazes me that they said the Kohen Gadol, if he wasn't worthy, would die in the Kodesh Kodashim. And yet it got to the point where there were so many unworthy ones, they would tie a string around their leg to schlep them out. So you would think that after it happened to the first person, no one else would want to do it. And yet, I guess power is a strange thing, as we see in today's world. So Yeshua says to Achan, who, just to recap, was from the tribe of Judah, we're given his yichus. By the way, the reason we're given his yichus is probably as a sort of back stab in the back. I can't think of the word. Stech, the same Yiddish to his family. There should be a stain upon them. There's no reason we have to be told all his family. But we are told, probably as a, I'm sure there's some story there.
Didn't you say that's the way that they narrowed it down to?
Well, that's true as well, but we didn't have to be told all that. So, same way that we're told Haman's yichus in the Megillah.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So, what happens next? Pam, would you like to read number 20?
And Achan answered Joshua and said, indeed, I have sinned against the Lord God of Israel, and thus have I done.
Right. Do you want to carry on since
Yeah.
it's going to give his confession?
When I saw among the spoils a goodly Babylonish garment and 200 shekels of silver and a wedge of gold of 50 shekels weight, then I coveted them and took them, and behold, they are hidden in the earth in the midst of my tent, and the silver under it. Carry on.
Yeah, do you want to finish off? Yeah.
And Joshua sent messengers, and they ran to the tent, and behold, it was hidden in his tent, and the silver under it.
So greed, basically, sees an opportunity. I don't know if he was an evil person, he was just an opportunist. People do things like that. It's always shocking when there's if you remember Hurricane Katrina, there was a lot of very immoral behavior associated with that, looting, and you have it whenever there's,
Any natural disaster.
yeah, there's always people that come take advantage. And the most amazing thing is, if you remember from the riots in London, of whenever it was, when was it, 2000 and whatever, in the summer, people were actually people were coming out with these justifications, people would be calling in like chat shows saying, well, TVs are too expensive, so it's only right that we went and grabbed one, and we're on minimum wage, so it's okay to go and steal stuff, and all kinds of justifications. We know from previous conflicts, if you like, so from Midian and from Amalek, we know from all kinds of times how important the spiritual component of any war was. So whether it was a defensive war like Amalek, or whether it was, even though it's not politically correct nowadays, the conquest of the land, it was a divinely mandated war, but nonetheless it had to be done within certain parameters. And presumably if you deviated from God's command, then you lost his blessing. So the point here is that the moment that there were provisions, I think, for the spoils of war. They weren't required to completely leave them alone, but there were certain rules in place which were given. I think it's Parshas Matos or Masai. And if you deviate from that, then you obviously lose your moral high ground, as it were. And the moment you do that, then it all seems a bit weird. It's like you have with some things that took place in Iraq, and alleged murder of Iraqi civilians, and you all think war is very chaotic, and it all seems like a bit of a fine line between internationally legally recognized murder, which would be people going shooting at other soldiers, and the sort of inappropriate treatment of POWs and things like that. I mean, if you're a pacifist, you'd say probably it's all murder, and if you were sort of Mr. Putin, you'd probably say it's all justified. So there's a spectrum somewhere, but we find the same thing in halacha. So obviously, what is mandated by Torah is okay, whether that involves, unfortunately, loss of human life or capture of spoils, but anything beyond that is completely unacceptable, which I guess is also how international law works nowadays. It always seems rather strange to me.
I find it quite a difficult subject. On the religious program this morning, they had various Christian theologians talking about the just war, the just war,
Right.
Tying themselves up in all sorts of arguments.
Right, which is of course a biblical concept.
Yeah.
But other than the wars for the conquest of the land of Israel, I mean, it's funny, when they get upset nowadays and accuse Israel of things, all the recent wars since 1948 were defensive wars. The real claim should be on Joshua, which was definitely an offensive war, but it was mandated by God to go and capture conquer the land of Israel. That should be the one that the UN should be complaining about, but they seem to have missed. They're not very good at history. It's very sad what's happening in Ukraine, and a lot of I have many colleagues there in Jewish communities that are in danger. Not sure that the Ukrainians are the poster boys for innocent victims.
Quite.
I know they're being portrayed as this beacon of democracy but I was reading somewhere that they know what to do with their enemies as well. And we now keep hearing that the president is Jewish, which is interesting and probably totally relevant. Marx was also Jewish, and so was Jesus. So I'm not saying he's a bad guy, but this assumption that because he's Jewish, he can do no wrong is also not totally doesn't fly.
The Ukrainians were among the Nazis' most enthusiastic helpers.
Yes, well, I remember when they had the European football a couple of years ago, and there was some racism going on against players, and it was held in Ukraine. I remember thinking, well, nothing's changed in 70 years. So, but obviously it destabilizes the world, it leads to loss of innocent life, and it puts our brethren and sisters at risk. So that alone is a cause for great concern. But it's like Iraq and Kuwait. I didn't really personally feel particularly behind the Gulf War. When you hear about the Kuwaitis' attitude to democracy and Israel, and but then I suppose there is no perfect victim.
No.
I think what's more worrying is that Putin's been doing this since the Crimea 8 years ago, pushing towards Poland. There are very strong echoes of what Hitler did. Maybe he models himself on it, for all we know. And he's clearly a despotic madman.
Or on Stalin. more like.
Yes, yeah. Maybe he's clearly a despotic madman who's got delusions of grandeur. The fact that his target may not be squeaky clean doesn't take away from that. So hopefully it will all calm down. We're talking about protests and Russian lawmakers sort of protesting and so on. But whether that will have any real effect, who knows? And they've thrown Russia out the Eurovision, which must really be scaring him. That's rather bizarre, you know. That's going to push him over the edge.
I think it was illustrative that when when Iran was thrown out of the SWIFT banking system,
Right.
apparently its economy tanked by 30%.
Okay.
So that's interesting.
That is significant, but they haven't managed to do that yet. They've opposition in Europe.
Have
they finally agreed?
No, they've targeted certain banks, but
Right.
the argument for not targeting all of them is because they're channeling charity aid and X, Y,
Right.
Z, but there needs to be tougher action.
Right. And most oligarchs that they're boycotting, quite a few are Jewish by all accounts.
Sure.
And then you've got Romovich saying, I've done nothing wrong and being persecuted. So all very hard to know who's. Anyway, so you see that when the Christians talk about a just war, their argument is what? That who's being just, Putin or Ukrainian resistance?
Well, they weren't being black and white about it, but the implication was that the Ukrainians were fighting a just defensive war.
Well, I assume, generally speaking, if you're invaded, the right to defend yourself, unless you're Israel, is generally a given.
Yeah.
You don't have to justify why you went to war. You went to war because you were attacked, presumably.
Yeah.
So this chap Achan, he's never appeared in this before. Probably not just an opportunist. I would say that from the fact that he owns up immediately. That when you learn the Gemara and it talks about two people that are fighting or arguing over an object that they found, the lost object and things like that. We're not talking about hardened criminals here. We're talking about an opportunity. He saw an opportunity. He saw some gold. You know, he saw dollar signs, pound signs, or euro signs with his eyes, and he grabbed it. And he now realizes he shouldn't have, and he admits it. Yeshua sends messages, and they find the silver. They find it hidden tent. Right. Okay. What happens next? Howard, back to you. Oh, Julian. Sorry, 23.
And they took them from the midst of the tent and brought them to Joshua and to all the children of Israel and laid them out before the Lord.
Right. We have we've got a problem. On the one hand, all he did was took some silver and gold. It's only money, as they say. On the other hand, you also have this issue of precedent that if you, and saying this to Putin as well, because he basically saw that nobody batted an eyelid when he invaded the Crimea. In fact, people have forgotten about it, but he thought he could get away with this. You always have the problem making an example. You see this more in America because judges are elected. So they often feel they have to be tough on crime, or they have to take a certain line of what's politically correct because they want to get elected. So often sentencing or obviously verdicts are jury verdicts, but sentencing will go in sort of, they'll say, this chap was, dealing a small amount of drugs, but because we've got so much low-level dealing going on, we're going to make an example of him in order that others should be deterred, which is what's going to happen here, basically. Which might seem harsh, but I suppose that if you look at it, that if you get God angry, then which is far more worrying, then sometimes it's a very different sort of a mindset. It's drummed into us nowadays how saving one life is always takes precedence over almost anything, and we go to great extremes to protect human life in halacha, and in all this in Tanakh, people are quite dispensable. Really, it's very different. The underlying moral sort of principle doesn't change of pikuach nefesh, but we seem to have a more cavalier attitude to human life. Even if you just look at war. I know the Torah talks about seeking peace, but we don't really see much of that. There's quite a lot of bloodshed going on. Would you like to carry on? That's probably we'll do one side each.
And Joshua and all Israel with him took Achan the son of Zerah and the silver and the garland and the wedge of gold, and his sons and his daughters, his ox, and his ass, and his flock, and his tent, and all that he had. And they brought them up to the valley of Achor. And Joshua said, why have you troubled us? The Lord shall trouble you this day. And all Israel stoned him with stones and burned them with fire after they had stoned them with stones.
Heavy stuff.
It is all of them. Doesn't say what happens to the stuff as yet.
No. So just going back to the map for a minute, if you're interested, right, there's the Valley of Achor on the top right there. See,
Is it the red thing?
it's the thing with the, yeah, with the there, Valley of Achor.
Yeah.
Quite close together. You got Gilgal and Jericho in general. This whole business of stoning people and things. Let's accept for a moment that it was something that was done. Once people had a sort of a thirst for it, how did you? They have in. Was it with executioners in the old days? Or I'm trying to think if it's. They would be hooded, wouldn't they?
What, the victims or the
No, the executioners as well. Was that so? There were no. Was that? Or am I misremembering?
I know that the people about to die would be hooded. Some of them
Maybe I'm
said, "No, I
misremembering.
won't have one hood."
Maybe I'm misremembering.
Possibly.
I'm thinking that there's a scenario, and I can't remember what it is. Maybe it was firing squads where you wouldn't actually know who had actually fired the fatal shot, and part of the maybe it was firing squads. Part of the idea was that you wouldn't have the guilt. Maybe it's firing squads, right? So
I mean, executioners were well known and
That's-
very practiced.
yes, that's true.
Everybody
Yeah, I
knew
must
exactly
I
who
must
they
be thinking
were.
of firing squads, but I do wonder, and I don't know what the commentaries say about it. That if you take a docile population and say, we're now going to stone this adulterer or this fornicator or whatever it is, or in this case, this chap. And then the next day you say to them, right, you're only allowed to stone people when I say so. At what point do people get a taste for it? Because it's a little, nowadays we would surely say that, you can't. It's like when you see people burning bins and things in Yerushalayim, and then you hear about, or B'nai Brak happens from time to time, they like to protest. And then, the next thing you hear that, someone's taken it too far and someone's burned a shul or something. And the usual reaction to these things is, unfortunately, once you send that message that that's the way to behave, then don't be surprised if your kids take it to the next level. So if you see adults burning bins in the streets in protest of the government, don't be surprised if the kids then say, well, we'll take it one step further, we'll burn cars, because you've shown them the path. So I wonder how they managed the sort of mob. In fact, we know Moshe at one point was afraid that people would kill him, if you recall.
When was that?
Right? He says to Hashem, he says, these people, they'll kill me next. Wasn't it when they were complaining about the food? One of the times they were complaining, Moshe says to Hashem, he says, they're gonna overrun me. It would surely be quite frightening. I mean, you think about Pakistan and India today and these places where you still hear stories of quite worrying stories. There was one in Pakistan recently about, I think, in India, it's usually a rape victim who's then been victimized, sometimes sort of been stoned to death or attacked for bringing shame, and the victim gets blamed, and it's tribal justice and all this kind of thing. It's all quite worrying. You think, what possesses people to act in that way if they're civilized people?
Well, you just answered it, because they're not.
Right. But how
Because they have done over the centuries.
okay, so how do you, if you have, because it says when people were stoned, I believe, by the way, they didn't throw stones at people actually. I think what they actually did was placed a heavy stone or something. It was still quite painful through it or something. He didn't actually pelt people with stones. If you look at stoning as a death penalty, I believe the way it was done was the stone was dropped on them. So it's still not very nice, but you didn't have the crowd throwing stones. Here, though, that's probably what it was. Probably look at the commentaries and see. I just wonder how you reconcile. You say to people, it's okay to stone the bad guys, but you shouldn't throw stones at your little brother or whatever. Anyway, right. So I forgot to bring my copy of Rashi, so I don't know if I presume they would have burned the spoils because that would have been tainted. There's an interesting, I got to share once about, it was actually about animal testing.
Hmm.
Should you test things on animals? What does halacha say about it? But it got into the question of waste generally. So where there's and this would be quite topical with environmental stuff, but possibly not politically correct, but where there's a genuine use for something and there's a compelling argument, then we would accept things so we might say that there is a principle about Ashkas that you shouldn't waste things, but nonetheless, if somebody's pinched some gold in war and the only way to make an example is basically to, I don't know if you can burn gold actually, but whatever, to somehow destroy it. I mean, you hear these stories, you know, they've seized, you know, 30,000 fake Levi jeans somewhere in Africa and they burn them or whatever. And you think, you know, the Africans can't afford Levi's. Why can't we just give them to them?
Yeah.
You know, it's something peculiar about our Western, you know.
To make an example.
Yes, I know why they do it, but it's just, you know, doesn't, you know, kind of sit very nicely, does it?
Mm.
The example that I think the Talmud discusses is that in the old days, when the king died, they would kneecap his horses so that the next king, they were basically disabled, and the next king would have his own horses. It seems extremely cruel to the animals. Like, what do they do?
In Egypt, they used to bury everything,
Yeah.
including their
So-
family. And
So
servants
the
with them.
Talmud discusses whether that would have been a justified animal cruelty, and basically says that there was a reason there, which was what you just said, I don't remember what you call it, the removal of all the previous king's possessions, and that might have been a justification, which seems quite harsh nowadays. But
Yeah,
they buried, what do they do with the livestock and stuff?
in Egypt.
Yeah.
Don't know.
Presumably killed it first.
Yeah, maybe that just didn't sort of register anywhere, but
Yeah.
certainly the servants were all hiding to nothing with the bastard died,
Right.
and the wives and the children.
Yeah. And they do it in India. Is it the widows throw themselves on the?
Yeah.
Well, they get thrown, which is it?
I think, I'm not sure whether they do it voluntarily, did it themselves, something, isn't it? And the British banned it, but it's probably still going on.
Right. We live in a very different. I may make the mistake of listening to talk radio and things. I was thinking it was LBC I was listening to, and someone called in to say, well, you know, Britain's hardly a democracy, and what are you
Really?
talking about? Do you really understand what you're saying? Well, you know, Britain, you know, you can get arrested for hate crime and things like that. So, you know, the West has a lot of things wrong with it, but we do have relative freedom. Very strange. Right. So,
Radio, the sort of people who are going to be
Yes.
very people you
Yes.
don't want to be listening
yes,
to.
exactly. Kind of people that comment on the internet.
Mm.
So this is, so Yeshua says they made an example of them. We have to look at Rashi to see what actually happened to the spoils. And finally, Howard, back to you, would you like to read?
And they raised over him a great heap of stones to this day. So the Lord turned from the fierceness of his anger. Therefore, the name of that place was called the Valley of Afor to this day.
Achor is like related to Acher, which means like Acharon, the back, turning around, turning one's back. So it's a very different God from the one we preach about nowadays, who's all benevolent and just happy that you came to shul and that you remembered it was Yom Kippur or whatever. Famous story Rabbi Saxel's quotes, you know, about chap who's, I think he was in America or something, he's listening to radio, he hears it's Yom Kippur and he remembers that you should really go say Yizkor for his father. He leaves the engine running while he pops in shul for 5 minutes and then goes out again. Rabbi Sachs says, you don't know, you have no idea how much nachas the Almighty gets from that. Contrast that with this, you know, this very angry God that's upset because you took some gold and silver. So I don't know if obviously Hashem has not changed. It's an interesting question as to how.
We had something like that here before your time, where somebody was driving up the road and it must be a nice day, the windows are open, you could hear the chauffeur. They stopped the car to listen to the chauffeur.
Oh, brilliant. There you go. Example, perfect example. It's possible we can say that back then everybody knew, first of all, God had revealed himself, and people generally were presumably more aware. I mean, they were all traveling around with Moshe and Yeshua, so they had less of an excuse to say, oh, I didn't know. I don't know. Because a lot of what we say nowadays is based on people's ignorance rather than any deep theological It does seem like we do have a different kind of slant on things.
Yeah.
Much as we say nothing changes, we do sort of have a very different way of looking at things.
Okay, there's a large number of people in this travelling mass, and will the message have got through to everyone?
So it's amazing, isn't it, how even if news always travels fast, even in, let's say, Shomer Shabbat communities where people are not on their devices, still news travels on Shabbos and Yom Tov. People talk. That's always been the way. So I can only assume that. I mean, I always wonder this about, when courts talk about making an example of someone, it's only relevant if it's reported.
Yeah.
If it's not reported, it doesn't help. So if the judge's exact wording at sentencing is not reported, it's not going to deter anyone. Or do they assume again that people hear about things?
I suppose from
They
the
get to hear
from
about
the
things.
accused,
Yeah.
go around with their fellow.
The problem nowadays is it's so easy to spread fake news. It's so easy to just start a complete nonsense which gets bandied around as truth. We know that fake news, I mean, the first recorded fake news is, I guess, well, there's a few things, isn't there? I mean, Eve gave the wrong instructions to Adam about the apple, but the spies, obviously, that's a bit of fake news there. When it was the Samaritans, wasn't it? What do they call them? What are they called?
Golden calf.
Golden calf, yeah. Who were the ones that used to light the flames on the hills? It was the Karaites, wasn't it? The Samaritans, wasn't it? That wanted to disrupt the new moon.
Oh, why?
We used to light flares because they had a literal interpretation of the Torah, I think, that it was the next day after Shabbos, so it was Sunday, and they basically didn't believe in the rabbinic Judaism, and the rabbis were the ones declaring the month, so they wanted to disrupt it, so they lit random flares. That's when the 2 days started. Originally, they used to light basically smoke signals. They would light a flare. The next town I would see at night one, and that quite quickly spread, presumably. And you see, oh, there's a beacon over there, right? And if people would know within a few hours. Then they started basically tampering with it.
Could have been either of them.
I think they're interchangeable, actually. And the whole Good Samaritan narrative of Christianity is actually a dig to the way the Jews regarded the Samaritans. I think that we didn't have much time for them because they rejected the Torah, and they said, well, he was a good Samaritan. It's interesting. Phrase has entered law in, I think, in the States and probably here as well. There are Good Samaritan laws. I think they protect you. So, like, if you help assault, because unfortunately they're trying to take their own life or something like that, you've got Good Samaritan laws that basically protect you and insure you, things like that. Or like if a doctor tries to help someone, doesn't manage, and then they complain about negligence, there's Good Samaritan laws. That's what they call it. So as is often the case, they put a monument. And I guess the argument would have been that by sacrificing this chap and his family, you're saving thousands of lives in the future of people who might otherwise have been deviant in war. But like I said, it's a different. So right at the beginning of this, the morality of this is quite challenging to our sense of morality and what we're brought up with. I wonder if it's still called the Valley of Achor today. Look it up. It's near Jericho.
That map that you were showing, a lot of the sites were still remain.
Yeah, I mean,
So
Bethel, you've got Bethel, Rimmon,
We were taken on.
Ophrah,
We had an archaeological day out
Right.
with a rabbi who's an archaeologist.
right?
And just on the left,
You have heard of him.
Sullivan.
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 Okay.
His son might have heard of him.
Sounds familiar. Okay.
So see Sha'arim,
Yeah.
it's just on the left there. That's a ruin, but
Right.
they reckon that it was the place because everywhere else just had one
Right.
gate. And that one had, you can just say Arim at the end. This place had two gates.
Right.
So therefore that was probably.
Oh,
the site
interesting.
of Sha'arim.
So a bunch of these places around today. I mean, the smaller places may also be, you just don't hear about them. I think Gilgal's around.
Mhm.
Ophrah is a settlement. Bethel. I don't know about Mitzvah. I mean, I don't know if I's around. Yeah.
Bethel is right by, what's the Palestinian place that's right by Bethel?
I can't think. I know what you mean.
It's a big one.
Used to go there. They're quite right wing over there. I can't think. I know what you mean. They don't have fences around. Well, they didn't when I went there 25 years ago. And they would say, we get on fine with our neighbours. That's what you don't hear about.
Where Stuart Bramble lived, that was a gated.
That was,
can't remember what it was.
oh, Moshav. My aunt and uncle used to live there.
Yeah,
And the Myers used to live there.
Yeah.
Stuart and,
it's near, Gush.
yeah, I can't think what it's called.
Yeah.
I can't think what it's
Single
called.
name. Single
Yes.
word.
What's it called? Yeah, I know what you mean.
We've been past that anyway.
A lot of Anglos there, I think.
Yeah.
Right, so that's, we're ending on with a bit of destruction, I'm afraid, but all in a good cause. We need to see what happened to